All right, so I am talking about chapter 2 of the Democracy for the Few. Last week I did chapter 1. I have set that up on, I made a YouTube account, Parenti Stuff, for right now, but we're probably going to put these up on Collective. But if you want to just listen to chapter 1, chapter 1 was basically just, it was basically like an intro. It wasn't, he wasn't really getting into stuff. He starts getting into this with the Constitution here. So let me get into my notes first, and we'll go from there. Cutie will be coming up, to discuss a little bit, when we get after the first section. So, all right, so as I do these read and discusses, I will always open with some history or background that pertains to these subjects and points Parenti brings up. Chapter 2, entitled A Constitution for the Few, focuses on the origins of the U.S. political system and how the framers were looking to create a strong central government that would protect their class interests. That is, would protect the wealthy from the poor, because they were all wealthy. This chapter argues that the Constitution was a product of class struggle designed to maintain the power of the wealthy while providing a facade of democracy. All right. Yeah, I'll let you up, Cutie, when we're first playing the first bit of this, the first section. All right, so the Constitutional Convention was held in Philadelphia from May to September 1787. The convention resulted in the creation of the United States Constitution, a document that established a new framework for the nation's government, replacing the Articles of Confederation. Though it is difficult to get an actual wealth of the 55 framers, and believe me, I was trying to look into it as hard as I could. I was also looking into the number of the slaves and all that. But it's just not there. You can't really, the records weren't really kept as well until 1790, I guess, is when they really started doing a census in the United States. So that's kind of where our records start. So we, looking ahead, before that, it's a little hard, and you'll know because sometimes they're like, it's not known if this person had slaves. Okay. So anyhow, all the framers were wealthy and landowning wealthy people. And I'm going to get into this self-made man crap in a minute because of Ben Franklin. Hey, Ash. Thank you for coming. Thank you, everyone, for coming. So of the founding fathers, so if we look in 1776, the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence, 41 of them were slave owners. That's over 73%. That's, almost 3/4 of them were slave owners. So then we look 11 years later, of the 55 attendees of the 1787 Constitutional Convention, 25. This is what number I was getting. 25. Though I'm using a huge caveats with that, and I have a huge asterisk because if I look deeper into, I couldn't find a list of who they were saying were the 25. So I was trying to figure this all out, and when you dig in, there was always like, oh no, but so like you have. There was one where this guy, his family made tons of money with and owned slaves, and then he went off on his own. He just didn't have slaves, so he got his start from having slaves. And then you have Madison, who didn't own slaves himself, but bought and sold them to his wife's family. Or you have, it's such a head scratcher. This guy up in New Hampshire who had 2,300 acres, whether he had slaves or not. But he owned 2,300 acres of land. So it's a head scratcher whether or not. It's not known whether he has slaves. Nathaniel Gorham in Massachusetts, he's like kind of down in history as a pirate anyways, against the British, but privateer. Nathaniel Gorham of Massachusetts is listed as not, but was a merchant who owned ships that transported enslaved people from Africa to the States. So just on that, like, all of this stuff, but just knowing how things were and how things went even when the North didn't have slaves, the North was making money off slaves. We can just pretty much say that these people benefited towards their wealth from slavery in one shape or form. And another reason why, like, that drop in that 11 years, just to mention, so like basically Vermont abolished slavery, Pennsylvania passed, that they abolished it in 1777, 1780, Pennsylvania passed this act for gradual emancipation, which just meant like new, people born could not be enslaved anymore after a certain date, which I don't know, it didn't really emancipate the people that were in slavery. And then Massachusetts abolished it in 1783, followed by New Hampshire, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, which is the rest of New England because Maine is part of Massachusetts. They start to abolish it in 1784, and they were doing a gradual one. So by 1787, five or six of the states, no longer had slavery too. So, they couldn't really, whether they had people or not, they couldn't say that they had them. But anyhow, and also just to note, during the convention, the Northwest, it gets brought up, but the Northwest Ordinance is in play here. So some of these guys are land speculators out in the Northwest, and they do decide to go. They're not going to allow slavery out there. All right, so by trying to get away from a monarchy, we just created a new one who acted as if they, as misogynistic jerks who made their money off of exploiting the people they enslaved and the poor, had a higher moral standard and intelligence than those without money. It was a contradiction of them looking down their noses at the rabble while convincing enough they could pull themselves up by their bootstraps, even the boots that they couldn't even afford. That really got me. Okay. So as an aside, I would like to bring up the myth of the self-made man here, since Ben Franklin is in this mix. And, I'm calling him an asshole here. Okay. And was the asshole who first pushed that crap. Okay. His brother James apprenticed him into the trade of printing, giving him room and board. This is nepotism, not Franklin pulling himself up from the bootstraps. His common law wife, Deborah Reed, comes from a prosperous family. He met her when he was 17 and he was renting a room from her dad. So not from huge wealth like Washington and some of the other founding fathers, but not the self-made, myth. The self-made narrative just perpetuates individualism and erases erases the outside factors that help, such as, but not limited to, communal contributions, systemic privileges, and historical luck. When you actually start looking at these people, their claim of self-made always falls apart. And one last note before I play section 1, is the father of liberalism, of whom the framers turned to, John Locke, said he believed in life, liberty, and property. He said estates, which is property. And Jefferson changed that property to pursuit of happiness because, and this is, I don't know if this is part of the myth of Jefferson. I'm not buying half the stuff they say about Jefferson sometimes. So they're claiming that, Jefferson was seeing that they were turning away from slavery, that they didn't, and to use the word property because they were claiming that, they own these people, was phasing out. And since slaves were considered property, he didn't want that practice tied to the Constitution. As the story goes, is what I wrote. It's important to note, though, because happiness is a stand-in for property, and that causes a lot of confusion. And property or estates or happiness or whatever word they want to use there just meant wealth. All right, I'm going to go ahead and play the first section. Let me just get to it over here. Okay.
Chapter 2. A Constitution for the Few. To understand the U.S. political system, it would help to investigate its origins and fundamental structure, beginning with the Constitution. The men who gathered in Philadelphia in 1787 strove to erect a strong central government. They agreed with Adam Smith that government was instituted for the defense of the rich against the poor and grows up with their acquisition of valuable property. Class power in early America. Early American society has been described as egalitarian, free from the extremes of want and wealth that characterized Europe. In fact, from colonial times onward, men of influence received vast land grants from the crown and presided over estates that bespoke an impressive munificence. By 1700, 3/4 of the acreage in New York belonged to fewer than a dozen persons. In the interior of Virginia, 7 individuals owned over 1.7 million acres. By 1760, fewer than 500 men in 5 colonial cities controlled most of the commerce, shipping, banking, mining, and manufacturing on the eastern seaboard. In the period from the American Revolution to the Constitutional Convention, the big landowners, merchants, and bankers exercised a strong influence over politico-economic life, often dominating the local newspapers that served the interests of commerce. In 12 of the 13 states, only property-owning white males could vote, probably not more than 10% of the total adult population. Excluded were all Native Americans, persons of African descent, women, indentured servants, and white males lacking sufficient property. Property qualifications for holding office were so steep as to exclude even most of the white males who could vote. A member of the New Jersey legislature had to be worth at least £1,000. South Carolina state senators had to possess estates worth at least £7,000 clear of debt. In Maryland, a candidate for governor had to own property worth at least £5,000. In addition, the absence of a secret ballot and of a real choice among candidates and programs led to widespread discouragement. Not long before the Constitutional Convention, the French chargé d'affaires wrote to his government, "Although there are no nobles in America, there is a class of men denominated gentlemen. Almost all of them dread the efforts of the people to despoil them of their possessions, and, moreover, they are creditors, and therefore interested in strengthening the government and watching over the execution of the law. The majority of them being merchants, it is for their interest to establish the credit of the United States in Europe on a solid foundation by the exact payment of debts, and to grant to Congress powers extensive enough to compel the people to contribute for this purpose." In 1787, just such wealthy and powerful gentlemen, our founding fathers, congregated in Philadelphia for the professed purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation and strengthening the central government. Under the Articles, the United States in Congress wielded a broad range of exclusive powers over treaties, trade, appropriations, currency, disputes among the various states, war, and national defense. But these actions required the assent of at least 9 states. The Congress also had no power to tax, which left it dependent upon levies agreed to by the states. It was unable to compel the people, through taxation, to contribute to the full payment of the public debt, most of which was owed to wealthy private creditors. The delegates to Philadelphia wanted a stronger central power that would resolve problems among the 13 states regarding trade and duties, protect overseas commercial and diplomatic interests, effectively propagate the financial and commercial interests of the affluent class, and defend the very wealthy from the competing claims of other classes within the society. It is and that are usually ignored or denied by too many textbook writers. Most troublesome to the framers of the Constitution was the insurgent spirit evidenced among the people. In 1787, a worried George Washington wrote to a former comrade-in-arms that a constitution was much needed to contain the threat of the people rather than to embrace their participation and their competence, lest the anarchy of the propertyless would give way to despotism. 7 Even plutocrats like Gouverneur Morris, who shortly before the Constitutional Convention had opposed strong federation, now realized that an empowered national government would be the best safeguard for propertied interests. So Morris gave up state rights for nationalism without hesitation. 8. The working people of that day have been portrayed as parochial spendthrifts who never paid their debts and who advocated inflated paper money. Most historians say little about the plight of the common folk in early America. Most of the white population consisted of poor freeholders, artisans, a constitution for the few 7 tenants, and indentured servants, the latter entrapped in payless servitude for years. A study of Delaware farms at about the time of the Constitutional Convention found that the typical farm family might have a large plot of land but little else, surviving in a one-room house or log cabin, without barns, sheds, draft animals, or machinery. The farmer and his family pulled the plow. In the United States of 1787, there existed poorhouses and a large debtor class. Small farmers were burdened by heavy rents, ruinous taxes, and low incomes. To survive, they frequently had to borrow money at high interest rates. To meet their debts, they mortgaged their future crops and went still deeper into debt. Interest rates on debts ranged from 25 to 40%, and taxes fell most heavily on those of modest means. No property was exempt from seizure, save the clothes on a debtor's back. Throughout this period, newspapers complained of the increasing numbers of young beggars in the streets. Economic prisoners crowded the jails, incarcerated for debts or non-payment of taxes. Among the people, there grew the feeling that the revolution against the British Crown had been fought for naught. Angry armed crowds in several states began blocking foreclosures and forcibly freeing debtors from jail. In the winter of 1787, impoverished farmers in western Massachusetts led by Daniel Shays took up arms. Their rebellion was forcibly put down by the state militia after several skirmishes that left 11 men dead and scores wounded.
Right. Okay. So, sorry about that. I was trying to look at a million other things. I need to figure out how to make people mods. I am actually in the studio and I am not sure how to do that here. All right. So that was section 1, called Class Power in Early America. So Parenti begins by why did I write that word? Demythologizing. I don't know what I'm writing there. The take that the U.S. is egalitarian, free from extremes of wants and wealth, and that characterized Europe. By bringing up how men of influence got a bunch of land gifted to them by the crown, and how these few in number white landowners lorded over the poor whites and people of color literally as their landlords. I tried to look up property ownership too. I was looking at all this stuff. At the time, Parenti mentions Delaware, where you could own the property, but have no means of working it. So that comes up in a later section here. So you'll hear about that. But that was kind of there were people who owned property but could not work it as a farm. They just didn't have the means. They didn't have the horses. They didn't have everything to do the work on it. So there were landowners who, were poor too, but they were, like most people were just living, renting and working and doing all that stuff. That was the bulk of the people in the United States and what they were doing. I see. Rick wants me to use an Italian guy. I don't know, Rick. Maybe I'll do that. Maybe, I don't know. I tried to look up, I just talked about that. Okay, hold on. Rick got me all confused now. All right. Parenti's estimate that the Constitution pertained to about 10% of the population when you remove women, children, slaves, indigenous, and property-less poor whites is probably pretty close to the number that this Constitution actually pertained to. When he talks about, let me just scroll up there at the beginning when he's talking about this, having at least 1,000 pounds, and where he's saying 7,000 is equivalent to over $1 million today. This was written years ago, so actually that 5,000 pounds is $1 million. That 7,000 is 1.4 million now. And let me get back down there. And let's see. I found a textbook used in schools to teach U.S. government called We the People by Patterson on the archive. I use the archive.org a lot to find books. It acts kind of like a library, where I don't think you have to have a library card, because I don't remember that I had to sign in with my library card, but you can rent out books. But there's also PDFs and stuff up there. This PDF is up there for free, so you can just get the PDF and not have to rent out the book from the library. Not you're renting it for free. It's not you're not paying for it. So I was looking through that. I wanted to like, okay, where's the, is there lies happening? Like what is going on when we're being taught about this stuff? Like what is happening in like these approved US, the states have to approve them. We talked about textbooks last week, and, they have to be approved and everything. So, where are the lies? And it's not so much the lies, it's more like what is not being said. Like they do some of this stuff with like the Ben Franklin being a self-made man, or they have like all these myths in there that get kind of put in. But I was only seeing that a little bit, but it was just like they weren't talking about the stuff. So they conveniently leave out views these men had on other groups, such they like their views on people, and what they thought of like the rabble and the masses and the mob, and all like how they just looked down, and they absolutely hated democracy. They thought democracy was just horrendous. So let me I'm gonna start bringing Cutie up. Let me see. So the framers such as Morris, who were all about states' rights, were convinced by the argument that the rich needed the protection of the federal government. And that was mainly because of what Cutie's going to talk about as Shays Rebellion. So that had happened. Hello, Cutie.
What am I talking about?
What are you talking about? You were going to tell us a little bit about Shays Rebellion right here, because he mentions Shays Rebellion at the end, and it says, the winter of 1787, impoverished farmers from Western Massachusetts, led by Daniel Shays, took up arms. Their rebellion was forcibly put down by the state militia.
Yeah. I mean, do you want to start with like the kind of like the background, like why it happened, or like who Daniel Shays was, or?
I want it all.
You want it all? Where are we starting then? I guess.
Start on the background of why it happened and who Daniel was.
Okay. So basically, Daniel Shays was this veteran of the Revolutionary War, right? And he had eventually been successful enough that he got promoted to being an officer, right? And he had his own like group of people. I think he might have been in general. I could be wrong right now, but basically, it was just so expensive for him to upkeep the standard that the Continental Army wanted him to have as an officer, that he basically went into like some pretty serious debt. And that's kind of your background for him, I guess. There wasn't really a whole lot that he did in the Revolutionary War. You know what I mean? What was happening in Western Massachusetts and Massachusetts generally after the Revolutionary War was really that the government of Massachusetts was also in extreme debt because of, having to bankroll and fund the war to begin with, right? And the war went on for something like 7 or 8 years. Am I right? Because it was 76 to 83, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So basically, in order to get the money that they needed to pay off debts in Massachusetts, they they ended up raising taxes. They had a regressive tax rate. So if you know anything about, progressive tax rates, how, the less income you have, the less you get taxed proportionately. And the more you have, the more you get taxed, right? They actually had the opposite system. The wealthier you were, the less taxes you had to pay, because they presumed that you had loans that pertained to the war, or, you were a Bostonian that they cared more about, because it was primarily like a bourgeois merchant and trader class that was running the government at the time. So what they did is they put all these regressive tax rates on, all of Massachusetts, and it led to all these farmers who are now dealing with, some difficulty with this winter, right? Some difficulty with other, harvests, and they're already subsistence farmers to begin with, right? suddenly you're levying higher taxes on them, and you're asking them to pay more money than they have to pay the government, right? So imagine that you're a group of guys who just fought a war supposedly because of, an issue with, no taxation without representation, and you just got out of this war. You're already in debt. Now you're extra in debt because you have to take on all these loans to be able to pay these increased taxes. And you had almost nothing to do with those taxes being made in the first place. You know what I mean? So imagine you just fought a war talking about, hearing all these goobers, all these guys in these cities, all these merchants, these bourgeois guys, telling you that you need to fight for them because, you'll get representation. And then after the war, you don't have representation. You're living worse than you were before. You owe debts to these people. You have just about no capacity to get any legal recourse. So what do you do? Know what I mean? What do you do when you're going further and further into debt? And the government, what they ended up doing was when these farmers started defaulting on their debts, right? They would have forced seizures. So they would come in and they would start seizing, farmers' property, right? So what happens is, all these people start getting really pissed off. They start basically all across Massachusetts, not just Western Massachusetts, basically anywhere outside of the coastline, west of Boston, right? They start having these little militias, these little like farmer revolts happening, where they start and they go to the courthouses where all the debts are being, all these like property seizures are happening, like according to the court, because of defaulted debts. And what they're doing is they're blocking it. They're trying to block the judges from being able to get in there to actually like legally pursue land or property seizure. So what happens is in a lot of these towns, the Massachusetts militia gets mobilized, right? And in one spot, I'm trying to think of it, it was really, really West Coast. It was like, not West Coast, but Western Massachusetts. I think it was Barrington or something like that, right? What happens there is there's 1,000, give or take, where they're blocking the courthouse, and they kind of disperse the protesters, right? They get in, they get ready to start doing the court proceedings, and one of the officers in the army goes, "Let's have a vote. Everybody who goes to the left side of the road is in favor of opening up the tax or opening up the courthouse. Everybody that goes to the right side of the road is against it." And this was only the militiamen that were participating in this, right? The majority, this might be a surprising situation, a horrific situation if you're, a capitalist in Boston hearing about this shit. But the majority of the militiamen actually said no to opening up the courthouse that they were just sent there to ensure got opened. So basically, all these Massachusetts militiamen are mobilized and sent out to all these courthouses to make sure that the courts can function, right? And in a very large, amount of cases, the militiamen actually swap sides or don't help at all or refuse the call entirely, right? So now you're getting this situation where basically all the courthouses in this whole area west of Boston are having to deal with, to one extent or another, people refusing to pay not only taxes but also their debts. So you have the government who has a shit ton of loans from the Revolutionary War that is trying to levy all these taxes to get all this money. You have all these wealthy guys who are in the government who need, this money to pay off their debts and loans as well, right? And all the farmers who they are exploiting, right, who they're effectively stealing from, right, objectively stealing from, are just like, no, we're not doing that. So what happens is this Daniel Shays, he's actually not even the leader. He just is kind of like the center of like kind of like a fear mongering campaign by capitalists in Boston. But either way, right? Him and these other guys end up moving their troops, right? All these militiamen and farmers that they've kind of like conglomerated. They've gotten together, and they march them to Springfield, which happens to have a federal armory from the Revolutionary War with cannons and guns and gunpowder and all sorts of shit, right? What happens is some of these militiamen, part of the like Massachusetts, guard, I guess, right, are actually in the armory or around, right, and they end up like illegally seizing some of the cannons from the Springfield Armory in Massachusetts, right, Western Massachusetts. And while all this is going on, the wealthy capitalists from not Richmond, what the fuck am I talking about? Wealthy capitalists from Boston, right? They are basically, because they're completely incapable of like getting a traditional army through conscription or anything like that, and they can't really get any federal support. Their plan is to basically purchase a mercenary army. And you can correct me if I'm wrong. I think it's around 3,000 guys. It's headed by this guy who has the last name Lincoln. I can't remember his first name at the moment. But they start marching west. The guys that are in the Springfield Armory, Daniel Shays and his farmers start marching up to the armory. And they open fire on Daniel Shays' guys. The Shaysites, as they're called, I guess, they start retreating, and then Lincoln and his mercenary troops start, moving westward, and mopping up, a bunch of farmers, farmer revolters, I guess, right? I think some of them were called regulators and stuff like that, but basically the fear that the capitalists and the bourgeois in Boston had was that the Shaysites, right, these peasants, basically the freeholders, right, their fear was that they were going to mobilize and go and take over Boston and basically cancel all debts and start redistributing wealth. Now, that's almost objectively not what was going to happen, but that was what their fear was, right? That was what got them to, cough up the money for the mercenary army in the first place. But one of the things that they did sort of like on the back end, as the rebellion, which was really relatively short. I think it started in August and it ended in like, January or February or something like that. The governor had basically set up this thing where
Dylan, we're talking about Shays Rebellion right now.
So the governor had set up this idea, right? They passed these laws. So they imposed martial law. Just to clarify, they imposed martial law. They suspended habeas corpus, which is right to trial, right before being imprisoned, or sentenced, I guess, right. And what they do is they basically have all these stipulations that if you were a member or abetted or aided in any way any of these rebellions, not only would you lose your right to vote, but you could also be put to death. You could have all of your property, 100% of your property seized by the state. And yeah. So they basically, for around a year, it was supposed to be 3 years, right? It was supposed to be 3 years, but it really only lasted for about a year, right? Because John Hancock, the next governor, who was the governor before, came back and then kind of like sorted out some stuff later, right? But basically, it was a plan for the bourgeois to completely cut out the voting base of the peasants, the freeholding people in Western Massachusetts and west of Boston generally. What happened is it didn't work out for them because basically it turned out that that voter turnout just exceeded the amount of people that were excluded in the first place. And not a lot of people were very happy with the way that the previous governor ran things. So what ended up happening is a lot of the things that the Shays Rebellion actually wanted, which was some minor cancellation of debts, the ending of regressive tax rates, increased representation for the rural areas of Massachusetts west of Boston, those ended up getting given to them. And that, I think we can obviously argue, that if they were successful, if the rebellion was successful, it would have probably resulted in a better situation for the farmers generally, right? But it's really another example to me that, the rebellion, the revolution that they had, however, short it was, right, resulted in ultimately a positive outcome for most of the people, west of Boston, because why would they have ever gotten rid of the regressive tax rate or any of these things if not for the threat of, workers and peasants and, people like that coming and redistributing the wealth that was stolen from them by the bourgeois. Know what I mean? But I think that's probably where I could end it. Know what I mean? If there's any other questions, I can elaborate from there.
Yeah, I'm having a little issue with I'm having issues with sound all through this, so I'm gonna have to use my other computer for Thursday. But I'm trying to put it into my earphones, and I'm not getting the speaker in the earphones, so I was trying to stay muted, but. Yeah, if you guys have any questions for Cutie while he's up here, just let us know. But I wanted to bring him up with that. Do you wanna stay up for a little bit, or I know you weren't feeling great?
Yeah, I mean, I can stay up for a minute if people have questions, but if not, then I can drop down.
Yeah, we'll give it 1 minute. Let's see if anyone, because I know there's a little delay. And that was my problem. I was listening through the phone and there's a delay. So then I talked over to you and we were talking about the Shays Rebellion thing. So, Dylan, the whole thing, so I'm going through Democracy for a Few, and we were talking about the Constitution, and the one of the main reasons why they wrote the Constitution, the way that they did was to not have people like Daniel Shays be able to become a populist and get into government and do stuff. That was one of their main worries.
Well, it kind of sparked all these rebellions across the whole area. It kind of sparked this debate, this really big debate for all these states kind of talking about how maybe they, the Articles of Confederation don't work because it gives too much freedom to the states, because too much freedom means that the federal government can't have a large enough standing army to put down these rebellions. So ironically, literally the Constitution, right, in many instances is written specifically in order to avoid redistribution of wealth by the freeholding, farmers, and also obviously to the not freeholding farmers, specifically the slaves in the South, to avoid them from getting freedom or from anybody organizing and redistributing wealth.
Dylan, for your other question, was Marx a patriarchal misogynist and racist? Most men are misogynists. As a woman, I'm just going to tell you that. So I don't really take much of that to heart, especially from 150 50s.
Yeah, he's a German guy from the 1850s.
Yeah. So I don't worry about it too much.
If we're going based off of other German guys at the 1850s, he's like the least. Not even.
Yeah, the least of my worries. So,
But yes, he does say bad things. Not even.
yeah, definitely. The whiskey insurrection. Rick's bringing up the whiskey insurrection.
Yeah, I don't really know that much about the whiskey insurrection.
Rick, I can bring you up. I can bring you up later if you want to talk about it. All right. So if we're off of Shays, I'm gonna let Cutie. I'm gonna let Cutie down, and we'll get into part 2, and then you want me to just? Oh, he's disconnecting. Okay. All right. Okay. So let's start listening to part 2. Where am I at? Okay. Hold on a second.
Containing the spread of democracy. The specter of Shays' Rebellion hovered over the delegates who gathered in Philadelphia 3 months later, confirming their worst fears. They were determined that persons of birth and fortune should control the affairs of the nation and check their leveling impulses of the propertyless multitude who composed the majority faction. To secure the public good and private rights against the danger of such a faction, wrote James Madison in Federalist No. 10, and at the same time preserve the spirit and form of popular government is then the great object to which our inquiries are directed. Here Madison touched the heart of the matter: how to keep their form and appearance of popular government with only a minimum of the substance. How to construct a government that would win some popular support but would not tamper with the existing class structure. A government strong enough to service the growing needs of the entrepreneurial and landed classes while withstanding the egalitarian demands of the ordinary populace. The framers of the Constitution could agree with Madison when he wrote that the most common and durable source of faction has been the various and unequal distribution of property. Those who hold and those who are without property have ever formed distinct interests in society, and the first object of government is the protection of different and unequal faculties of acquiring property. So government is there to see that those who have a talent for getting rich are not hampered in any way by those who might be made poor in the process. Religious freedom is my immediate goal, but my long-range plan is to go into real estate. The framers were of the opinion that democracy was the worst of all political evils, as Elbridge Gerry put it. For Edmund Randolph, the country's problems were caused by the turbulence and follies of democracy. Roger Sherman concurred: the people should have as little to do as may be about the government. According to Alexander Hamilton, all communities divide themselves into the few and the many. The first are the rich and the well-born, the other the mass of the people. The people are turbulent and changing, they seldom judge or determine right. He recommended a strong centralized state power to check the imprudence of democracy. And George Washington, the presiding officer at the Philadelphia Convention, urged the delegates not to produce a document merely to please the people. 13. There was not much danger of that. The delegates spent many weeks debating and defending their interests, but these were the differences of merchants, slaveholders, and manufacturers. A debate of haves versus haves in which each group sought safeguards in the new constitution for its particular concerns. Added to this were disagreements about constitutional structure. A constitution for the few. 9. How might the legislature be organized? How much representation should the large and small states have? How should the executive be selected? The founders decided on a bicameral legislation, consisting of a House of Representatives elected every 2 years in its entirety and a Senate with 6-year staggered terms. It was decided that seats in the House would be allocated among the states according to population, while each state, regardless of population, would have 2 seats in the Senate. Major questions relating to the new government's ability to protect the interests of property were agreed upon with surprisingly little debate. On these issues, there were no poor farmers, artisans, indentured servants, or slaves attending the convention to proffer an opposing viewpoint. Ordinary working people could not take off for months to go to Philadelphia and write a constitution. The debate between haves and have-nots never took place. Not surprisingly, Article 1, Section 8, that crucial portion of the Constitution that enables the federal government to serve the interests of investment property, was adopted within a few days with little debate. Congress was given the power to regulate commerce among the states and with foreign nations and Indian tribes, lay and collect taxes and excises, impose duties and tariffs on imports but not on commercial exports, pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States, establish a national currency and regulate its value, borrow money, fix the standard of weights and measures necessary for commerce, protect the value of securities and currency against counterfeiting, and establish uniform bankruptcy laws throughout the country, all measures of primary concern to investors, merchants, and creditors. Some of the delegates were land speculators who invested in Weston holdings. Accordingly, Congress was given the power to regulate and protect all Weston territorial property. Most of the delegates speculated in government securities, inflated paper scrip that the earlier Confederation had issued to pay soldiers and small suppliers. Wealthy speculators bought from impoverished holders huge amounts of these nearly worthless securities for a trifling. Under Article 6, all debts incurred by the Confederation were valid against the new government, a provision that allowed the speculators to reap enormous profits by cashing in the inflated scrip at face value. By assuming this debt, the federal government, under the policies of the first Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, used the public treasury to create by government fiat a vast amount of private capital and credit for big investors, to be funded by the government's newly established ability to lay taxes. The payment of the debt came out of the pockets of the general public and went into the pockets of moneyed individuals who were creditors to the government by virtue of their possessing the inflated scrip. This federally assumed debt consumed nearly 80% of the annual federal revenue during the 1790s. This process of using the taxing power to gather money from the working populace in order to bolster private fortunes continues to this day, as we shall see in the chapters ahead. In the interest of merchants and creditors, the states were prohibited from issuing paper money or imposing duties on imports and exports or interfering with the payment of debts by passing any law impairing the obligation of contracts. The Constitution guaranteed full faith and credit in each state to the acts, records, and judicial proceedings of other states, thus allowing creditors to pursue their debtors across state lines. Slavery, considered a major form of property, was afforded special accommodation in the Constitution. 3/5 of the slave population in each state were to be counted when calculating the state's representation in the lower house. This gave the slave states a third more representation in Congress than was otherwise merited. This disproportionate distribution of seats helped the slave interests to pass laws that extended slavery into new territories and discouraged Congress from moving toward abolition. The Constitution never abolished the slave trade. Indeed, the importation of slaves was explicitly guaranteed for another 20 years until 1808, after which there would be the option, but no requirement, that it be abolished. Many slaveholders assumed they would have enough political clout to keep the trade going beyond that year. Slaves who escaped from one state to another had to be delivered up to the original owner upon claim, a provision that was unanimously adopted at the convention. The framers believed the states were not sufficiently forceful in suppressing popular uprisings like Shays' Rebellion, so the federal government was empowered to protect the states against domestic violence, and Congress was given the task of organizing the militia and calling it forth to suppress insurrections. Provision was made for erecting forts, arsenals, and armories, and for the maintenance of an army and navy for both national defense and to establish an armed federal presence within potentially insurrectionary states. This measure was to prove a godsend to the industrial barons a century later when the U.S. Army was used repeatedly to break mass strikes by miners and railroad and factory workers.
Okay, so that was part 2. Hold on a second. Rick, if you want to come up now, you can talk a little bit, or I can just bring you up when I'm done with all the sections. But anyhow, so section 2 is called Containing the Spread of Democracy, and the majority faction, also known as the masses, the mob, the rabble, but should be referred to as the people, was propertyless. Madison states in the Federalist Papers that there have always been haves and have-nots in every society, so therefore the haves should be protected, keeping them haves, and the have-nots should not hamper the pursuit of happiness, which, as I stated before, just means wealth of the haves. So these dudes really did not like democracy, nor did they care much for the people, so settled to create a republic. The main difference between a republic and a democracy is the charter or constitution that limits powers in a republic, often to protect the individual's rights against the desires of the majority. They needed to push individualism, so they had to make these myths of the American dream, or that one can be or that one could be a self-made man. The Enlightenment was growing up alongside of the United States and was used to promote individualism as well. Hold on, Rick, I'll let you in a second. The founders made sure their direct interests were protected as well, such as the Western holdings, since a few of the framers were land speculators and wanted to make sure their investments out west paid off. So they were to be protected by the taxes collected by the government. This begins the United States expansion, its manifest destiny, the very start of its empire building. The 3/5 rule is just so disgusting. Not only did it just state that a person who should never be owned by another is only 3/5 of the person, but it actually gave the slave-owning states more power to make laws that strengthened and furthered slavery. And now the states were connected by a piece of paper that stated escaped slaves had to be returned. This also began the police state more, more and more with the organization of militias to protect against uprisings. If this document was such a great democratic masterpiece, why are they so scared of the people? Hold on, let me let Rick in. I think this is Rick. I don't know. We'll see in a second. All right. Hello, Rick.
Howdy. Yeah, so like this is actually like kind of a good spot to talk about the Whisky Rebellion, because like they were talking about how like they created this federal government in part to make sure that there was somebody to guarantee all of these all the bonds, the war bonds that were paid off by all these bankers. They wanted a guarantee on their returns, and the only way they could do that is to collect taxes, which was something that was not, they weren't able to do under the Articles of Confederation. They specifically couldn't collect taxes. The only way that the government could make money at the time was from postage. And so the second that the Congress was formed, they passed a tax. They passed a tax particularly on whiskey because they thought that that would not cause a lot of uprising, because they're like, whiskey's bad for you. You can avoid drinking whiskey if you want to. It's no big deal. But what they didn't anticipate is that the people who made whiskey were largely rural farmers in Appalachia because of the terrain. So like a lot of the roads obviously at the time weren't well developed. A lot of them couldn't afford horses and carts, but they'd have small plots of corn that they're growing in like these little mountain plots up in Appalachia. And the only way that they could bring that corn to market effectively was to turn it into whiskey, because it's a lot easier to carry, a crate of whiskey on your back than it is to 100 bushels of corn. So they distill it into whiskey. They bring in a lot of them. That was their entire living. That was their whole livelihood. The only money that they made in a year, they're living mostly off the land, but the only actual money that they made was from their whiskey. And so they essentially made their take on the whiskey next to worthless, because the taxes were pretty high, and a lot of them decided that they weren't going to pay the tax. And there was a point, and I can't remember exactly where. I want to say it's somewhere in Pennsylvania, where a group of them got together and they burned down the house of one of the tax collectors. And that was like the first time that the federal government sent in troops, and they sent troops to quell an insurrection. Like it says explicitly, like he was just talking about, they developed the system specifically so they could collect taxes. And yeah, a lot of the people just denied any involvement. They didn't find the people who actually burned down the mansion, but they sent the federal army there to quell the rebellion, and eventually, people got around to paying their taxes. And this is exactly like the reasoning for it. I think is directly to do that, to stop the rebellions and to collect taxes on the poorest people in the country, or some of the poorest people in the country. Obviously, not the enslaved people, but the next step up the ladder. They wanted to collect as much as they could, and it just seems really clear that they didn't care about the everyday people, certainly not the small farmers that they were intentionally impoverishing. And that was a fundamental structure. After Shays, they built a structure, and then they used it almost immediately to put down another insurrection. The second they built.
Yeah, you're right. I'm sorry, your microphone was a little low, and I put it up, and I don't know if I made it glitchy. I'm hoping it sounds better. Bongatho was pointing it out, that because I was trying to raise up your volume a little bit, but I think for a couple of seconds there you might have sounded a little. But yeah, no, I mean that was the whole thing. All these were to this Constitution was to protect them. It had nothing to do with protecting anybody else. So, what else was I going to do? Yeah, so,
largely
go ahead.
They were largely ignorant to the actual economic situation on the ground, right? They assumed that they could just like tax this thing and it'll be fine and like they'll be able to like hold it down. But it was very messy in the beginning because it took them a long time to call the troops in and to get the states to send the troops. It was definitely haphazard at the time, but they had a plan. They had a plan to actually address that, and it was mostly to protect bankers. That was the purpose of the Constitution, was protect bankers and landowners.
Yeah, for sure. Do you think though that they didn't realize how poor some people were? I mean, what is it like? I often wonder, even like now, like these people, like, do rich people really think that, like, do they even understand the sense of being poor? I don't know.
Well, I think that they just don't understand like the economic system and how it affects people, right? Like they're like, well, if we tax the whiskey, people will just drink less whiskey, no harm, no foul. Like poor people can just drink less whiskey and then they'll get more work done, right? It's like the thought at the time. They didn't take into account that like there are people who make whiskey, and it's kind of a lot of people at the time, and it's important for them to be able to do that to sustain a living. They didn't take any of that into account. They like don't think about those kind of things. The second and third order effects, they don't have any plans for, which is kind of the same thing now. Like they're just short-sighted. They see like the immediate effect and ignore the second and third order effects.
Rick is all bees. All right. All right, Rick, I'm gonna play section 3, and if you want to stay up and we can talk more after each section. Oh, no, Rick left. Rick left. Oh, if you want to come back up, I'm gonna start section 3. If you want to come back up, just request and I'll let you up later. All right. Hold on.
Fragmenting majority power. In keeping with their desire to contain the propertyless majority, the founders inserted what Madison called auxiliary precautions designed to fragment power without democratizing it. They separated the executive, legislative, and judicial functions and then provided a system of checks and balances between the three branches, including staggered elections, executive veto, the possibility of overturning the veto with a 2/3 majority in both houses, Senate confirmation of appointments and ratification of treaties, and a bicameral legislature. They contrived an elaborate and difficult process for amending the Constitution, requiring proposal by 2/3 of both the Senate and the House and ratification by 3/4 of the state legislatures. To the extent that it existed at all, the majoritarian principle was tightly locked into a system of minority vetoes, making swift and sweeping popular action less likely. The propertyless majority, as Madison pointed out in Federalist No. 10, must not be allowed to concert in common cause against the propertied class and its established social order. The larger the nation, the greater their variety of parties and interests, and the more difficult it would be for a mass majority to act in unison. As Madison argued, a rage for paper money, for an abolition of debts, for an equal division of property, or for any other wicked project will be less apt to pervade the whole body of the Union than a particular member of it. An uprising of impoverished farmers might threaten Massachusetts at one time and Rhode Island at another, but a national government would be large enough to contain each of these and insulate the rest of the nation from the contamination of rebellion. Not only should the low-income majority be prevented from coalescing, its upward thrust upon government also should be blunted with indirect forms of representation. The senators from each state were to be elected by their respective state legislatures rather than directly by the voters. Direct popular election of the Senate was achieved in 1913 when the 17th Amendment was adopted, 126 years after the Philadelphia Convention, demonstrating that the Constitution is sometimes modifiable in a democratic direction, though it does seem to take a bit of time. Senatorial elections were to be staggered, with only a third of the Senate facing election every 2 years, thereby minimizing a sweeping change. The president was to be selected by an electoral college whose members, by 1800, were elected by the people in only 5 states, and by state legislatures or county sheriffs in the other 11 states. As anticipated by the framers, the Electoral College would act as a damper on popular sentiment. Composed of political leaders and men of substance, elected in each state by the voters, the Electoral College would convene months after the election in their various states and choose a president of their own liking. It was believed they usually would be unable to muster a majority for any one candidate, and that the final selection would be left to their House, with each state delegation therein having only one vote. The Supreme Court was to be elected by no one, its justices being appointed to life tenure by the President, with confirmation by the Senate. The only portion of government to be directly elected by the people was the House of Representatives. Many of the delegates were against this arrangement. They were concerned that with direct elections demagogues would ride into office on a populist tide only to pillage the treasury and wreak havoc on the wealthy class. John Mercer observed that he found nothing in the proposed constitution more objectionable than the mode of election by the people. And Gouverneur Morris warned, "The time is not distant, when this country will abound with mechanics and manufacturers who will receive their bread from their employers. Will such men be the secure and faithful guardians of liberty? The ignorant and dependent can be little trusted with the public interest." 18. When the delegates finally agreed to having the people elect the lower house, as noted earlier, they were referring to a select portion of their population that excluded almost all white males without property, all Native Americans, all indentured servants, and all females of whatever race. Also excluded were slaves, who constituted almost 1/4 of the nation's population. Even among those African Americans who had gained their freedom in both North and South, few were allowed to vote.
All right, so that is section 3. That's a short section. It's called Fragmenting Majority Power. I mentioned last week how Jefferson believed that the Constitution should be rewritten every generation. But the framers went ahead and made sure that it was near impossible to do. Like where parentheses above saying like, okay, you can change it, because they did change it 126 years later to make the senators be, you had people could vote for the senators where they couldn't for all that time before that. And, we still have to keep remembering, we don't really elect our president. Our the Electoral College is the ones that elect them. So they wanted to protect against the people, the very opposite of a democracy. I feel like I keep repeating myself because that's basically what this whole chapter is about, is how much they hated democracy, how much they really just could not stand the people. The staggering of Senate elections, the Electoral College, and the appointing of judges to the highest court were just some of the ways they ensured this. They looked down on the people and didn't think they were intelligent enough to know what was good for them, which in their minds of the framers was to serve the framers in their class interests. The representatives would end up only being elected by a few of the people, excluding most white propertyless males, all indigenous peoples, all indentured servants, all women, and an entire 1/4 of population by excluding enslaved people. They made up at that point 1/4 of the population. So there, like that Governor Morris, he brings this guy up a couple of times, but like when he's talking about like the artisans, the factory mill workers, he is talking about, they know they're moving into industrialization. Jefferson's not, keen on moving into it, but some of these people, they were pushing for the industrialization, which began in, we consider it beginning in 1793 in the United States and Rhode Island. So that is when Slater Mill opened up. But yeah, so like this ignorant independent, but the thing that gets me is that the employer who's going to feed them their bread, like he's literally thinking of people as being like workers, just being slaves, like no difference. Like the factory owner is going to feed you your bread. Like that just hit me too. Like they knew exactly what they were doing there. Yes, you were an Electoral College elector in 2020. I do remember that. All right. Let me just get on to part 4, because this was a small chapter, but
plotters or patriots. Innocently argued that the framers were guided by the interests of their affluent class. Disputing Beard are those who say that the framers were concerned with higher things than just lining their purses. True, they were moneyed men who profited directly from policies initiated under the new constitution, but they were motivated by a concern for nation building that went beyond their particular class interests. That is exactly the point. High-mindedness is a common attribute among people even when, or especially when, they are pursuing their personal and class interests. The fallacy is to presume that there is a dichotomy between the desire to build a strong nation and the desire to protect wealth, and that the framers could not have been motivated by both. In fact, like most other people, they believed that what was good for themselves was ultimately good for their country. Their nation-building values and class interests went hand in hand, and to discover the existence of the higher sentiment does not eliminate the self-interested one. Indeed, the problem is that most people too easily and self-servingly believe in their own virtue. The founders were no exception. They never doubted the nobility of their effort and its importance for the generations to come. Just as many of them could feel dedicated to the principle of liberty for all while owning slaves, so could they serve both their nation and their estates. The point is not that they were devoid of the grander sentiments of nation building, but that there was nothing in their concept of nation that worked against their class interest and a great deal that worked for it. The framers may not have been solely concerned with getting their own hands in the till, although enough of them did, but they were explicitly concerned with defending the interests of the wealthy few from the laboring many. The Constitution, as Stoughton Lynd noted, was the settlement of a revolution. What was at stake for Hamilton, Livingston, and their opponents was more than speculative windfalls in securities. It was the question, what kind of society would emerge from the revolution when the dust had settled, and on which class the political center of gravity would come to rest. 19. The small farmers and debtors, who opposed a central government that would be even further from their reach than the local and state governments, have been described as motivated by self-serving, parochial interests. Unlike the supposedly high-minded statesmen who journeyed to Philadelphia, how and why the wealthy became visionary nation builders is never explained. Not too long before, many of them had been proponents of laissez-faire and had a constitution for the few. 13. Opposed a strong central government. In truth, it was not their minds that were so much broader but their economic interests. Their motives were no higher than those of any other social group struggling for place and power in the United States of 1787. But possessing more time, money, information, and organization, they enjoyed superior results. Though supposedly dedicated to selfless and upright goals, the delegates nevertheless bound themselves to the strictest secrecy. Proceedings were conducted behind locked doors and shuttered windows. Madison's notes, which recorded most of the actual deliberations, were published, at his insistence, only after all participants were dead, 53 years later, most likely to avoid political embarrassment to them. The founders were motivated by high-minded objectives, some people say, but they repeatedly stated their intention to erect a government strong enough to protect the haves from the have-nots. Deliberating behind closed doors, these wealthy men gave voice to the crassest class prejudices and most disparaging opinions about popular involvement. Their concern was to diminish popular control and resist all tendencies toward class equalization. Their dedication to their propertied class interests were so unabashedly avowed as to cause one delegate, James Wilson of Pennsylvania, to complain of hearing too much about how the primary object of government was property. The cultivation and improvement of the human mind, he maintained, was the most noble objective of the polity, a fine sentiment that evoked no opposition from his colleagues as they continued about their business. The framers supposedly had a realistic opinion of the rapacious nature of human beings, readily evidenced when they talked about the common people. Yet they held a rather sanguine view of the self-interested impulses of their own class, which they saw as inhabited largely by virtuous men of principle and property. As their minority faction, these gentlemen would not sacrifice the rights of other citizens, especially the right to pursue property and wealth, a pursuit that they believed constituted the essence of liberty. In sum, the Constitution was consciously designed as a conservative document, elaborately equipped with a system of minority locks and dams in order to resist popular tides. The Constitution furnished special provisions for the slaveholding class and for a rising bourgeoisie. For the founders, liberty meant something different from democracy. It meant liberty to invest, speculate, trade, and accumulate wealth without encroachment by the common populace. The democratic civil liberties designed to give all individuals the right to engage in public affairs won little support from the delegates. When George Mason of Virginia recommended that a committee be formed to draft a Bill of Rights, a task that could be accomplished in a few hours, the other convention members offered little discussion on the motion and voted almost unanimously against it. If the Constitution was such an elitist document, how did it manage to win ratification? It was strongly opposed in most of the states. Virginia's Patrick Henry charged that the Constitution enabled a contemptible minority prevent the good of the majority, 23, but the same superiority of wealth, organization, and control of political office and ownership of the press that allowed the rich to monopolize the Philadelphia Convention enabled them to orchestrate a successful ratification campaign. The Federalists also used bribes, intimidation, and fraud against their opponents. What is more, the Constitution never was submitted to a popular vote. Conventions, each composed of delegates drawn mostly from the same affluent stratum as the framers. Those who voted for these delegates themselves usually had to qualify as property holders. Probably not more than 20% of the adult white males voted for delegates to the ratifying conventions.
All right. Oops. Just jumped off that. Hold on. So, yeah, one thing, one thing's funny because he puts like a lot of there's a lot of cartoons in here, and I was mentioning last week how I had read a Parenti and I wasn't sure what Parenti I read, and the reason why I finally figured out it was this book. Well, I mean, because it was about it was basically a poli-sci textbook, but it was one of the cartoons that's further down in the book. It was a BC cartoon, and that's how I realized I knew what this was. So in section 4 is called Plotters or Patriots. The framers' individualism and high-mindedness made them believe they were doing good for all by enriching themselves. This is a problem we see in liberalism. Imagine thinking you were bringing liberty for all while you were perfectly fine claiming you own other people. They are liberalism, John Locke, like all of the authors of liberalism were pretty much fine with slavery. So, how is my government stealing land from other people helping me directly? How is Trump stealing Greenland going to help any of us sitting here today? Okay. If these sometimes I do my meandering thoughts. If they really believe they were writing a document to serve all the people, well, why the secrecy? Madison's papers that weren't released until all 55 men were, buried, show exactly what these nation builders thought of the people they pretended that they were making the Constitution for, and who they actually wanted to be protected and benefit from it. Madison's papers were released in 1840, and almost 200 years later, there are folks out there that still believe they are building a democracy and cared about the people. I mean, you tell people that we are not living in a democracy, and they just they don't get it. My cousin was over earlier, and she's pretty she understands a lot of stuff. Her father was a Marxist-Leninist, so she kind of, but she doesn't, she doesn't get into it. She doesn't really pay too much attention to the details of it. She knows what's right and what's wrong, and she knows all that stuff. Like she knows sock dems are, not the answer and stuff like that. So, but she doesn't read on this stuff. She doesn't have the time to do this stuff. She's working all the time and stuff like that. So I had said earlier, I go, oh, we don't. Something about, she said something about Russia, and she's like, what do you think Russia's government is? And we were discussing that. And I go, it's as much of a friggin' democracy as we are here. And she was just like, what? And then she thought about it and she's like, oh yeah, you're right. It's just something she never thought about. So I think that, this whole chapter is just basically, I feel like I don't have much more to offer to it because, Parenti's hitting all the points of what these guys are saying, what these guys are thinking, why they did certain things for the Constitution, and who they were protecting and who they weren't protecting. And it's all there. It's in their own words. It's there. If you actually go and look at, I honestly have not read all the Madison papers, but I've read some of it, and more like quotes here and there. But yeah, it's just it's just like, I don't know. I just feel like this chapter is like, I don't have much more to add to it, because it's all just right there in the thing. So let's listen into section 5, and then if anyone wants to come up and discuss more after, you just hit the multi-guest, or I will let you up.
Democratic concessions. For all its undemocratic aspects, the Constitution was not without its historically progressive features. Consider the following: 25. The very existence of a written constitution with specifically limited powers represented an advance over more autocratic forms of government. No property qualifications were required for any federal officeholder, UN-. Like in England and most of the states, and salaries were provided for all officials, thus rejecting the common practice of treating public office as a voluntary service that only the rich could afford. A constitution for the few. 15. The president and legislators were elected for fixed terms. No one could claim a life tenure on any elective office. Article 6 reads, "No religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States," a feature that represented a distinct advance over a number of state constitutions that banned Catholics, Jews, and non-believers from holding office. Bills of attainder, the practice of declaring by legislative fiat a specific person or group of people guilty of an offense, without benefit of a trial, were made unconstitutional. Also outlawed were ex post facto laws, the practice of declaring some act to be a crime and then punishing those who had committed it before it was made unlawful. There was strong popular sentiment for a Bill of Rights. In order to ensure ratification, supporters of the new Constitution pledged the swift adoption of such a bill as a condition for ratification. So, in the first session of Congress, the first 10 amendments were swiftly passed and then adopted by the states. These rights included freedom of speech and religion, freedom to assemble peaceably and to petition for redress of grievances, the right to keep arms, freedom from unreasonable searches and seizures, freedom from self-incrimination, double jeopardy, cruel and unusual punishment, and excessive bail and fines, the right to a fair and impartial trial, and other forms of due process. The Bill of Rights, specifically the 9th Amendment, explicitly acknowledges that the people have a reserve of rights that go beyond the Constitution. Hence the enumeration of specific rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. The Bill of Rights also prohibited Congress from giving state support to any religion or designating any religion as the official one. Religion was to be something apart from government, supported only by its own believers and not by the taxpayer, a stricture that often has been violated in practice. Contrary to the notion propagated today by many religionists, the founders did not establish this nation upon religious principles. Thomas Jefferson advised that we question with boldness even the existence of a God. John Adams wrote, "This would be the best of possible worlds if there was no religion in it." James Madison concluded that during almost 15 centuries the fruits of Christianity have been superstition, bigotry and persecution in both clergy and laity. Benjamin Franklin openly questioned the divinity of Jesus. If the delegates in Philadelphia were intent upon inaugurating a Christian republic, why does the Constitution contain not a single reference to God, Jesus, or Christianity? As one Christian theologian conceded, the men who put together the Constitution were not Christians by any stretch of the imagination. 26. The Constitution consolidated the victory of republicanism over British imperialism. It guaranteed a republican form of government and explicitly repudiated monarchy and aristocracy. Hence, Article 1, Section 9 states, "No title of nobility shall be granted by the United States." According to James McHenry, a delegate from Maryland, at least 21 of the 55 delegates favored some form of monarchy. Yet few dared venture in that direction out of fear of popular opposition. Furthermore, delegates like Madison believed that stability for their class order was best assured by a republican form of government. The time had come for the rich bourgeoisie to rule directly without the troublesome intrusions of parasitic nobles and kings. On a number of occasions during the Philadelphia Convention, this assemblage of men who feared and loathed democracy found it necessary to show some regard for popular sentiment. If the Constitution was going to be accepted by the states and if the new government was to have any stability, it had to gain some measure of popular acceptance. While the delegates and their class dominated the events of 1787, 1789, they were far from omnipotent. The class system they sought to preserve was itself the cause of marked restiveness among the people. Land seizures by the poor, food riots, and other violent disturbances occurred throughout the 18th century in just about every state and erstwhile colony. This popular ferment spurred the framers in their effort to erect a strong central government, but it also set a limit on what they could do. The delegates gave nothing to popular interests. Rather, as with the Bill of Rights, they reluctantly made democratic concessions under the threat of popular rebellion. They kept what they could and grudgingly relinquished what they felt they had to, driven not by a love of democracy but by a fear of it, not by a love of the people but by a prudent desire to avoid riot and insurgency. The Constitution, then, was a product not only of class privilege but of class struggle, a struggle that continued as the corporate economy and the government grew.
Okay, all right. So, section 5, the last section of this chapter, is called Democratic Concessions. I wanted to bring out one thing. Well, I'll read my notes first. Parenti points out the progressive features that they did come up with, like protection for religious beliefs, but also of making the country an official religion, not making the country have an official religion, and limitations on length of elected offices and limited powers. This despite over 1/3 of them wanting to establish a monarchy. And despite some being against a Bill of Rights, that is what it took to get to the states to sign it. So, this great piece of work that these 55 people came up with and 39 of them signed, it needed a Bill of Rights. For it to get ratified in the states, it had to address more. So it was not a perfect piece of paper written right from the get-go. So and a note on concessions and why they are historically given. Basically, it is to shut the people up, but also they give them some cover for all the shitty things they and the ruling class gains over the people. All right, so basically, that is what I have to say about the text. If anyone wants to come up and talk about it a little bit, I am going to be doing this Thursday again, chapter 3. I'll have a little bit more. I have some other things I pulled up for chapter 3. I felt like this chapter is just kind of like I don't know. It's all in there, and it is really just. It's serving the purpose of showing you who was making these laws. We talk about them being, they think they're morally, superior. They think they're much more intelligent. They think that they know what to do. And, this is where it goes into like cui bono, what Parenti's always like, who does it benefit? So, one of the videos I just put up was, about, he always talks about the rich lands of like Africa or South America. And, they were not poor, they were rich, the spiel from Yellow Parenti, but he also talked about that in 1991 about Appalachia. So even in our own country, we did the same thing. They went in, the Rockefellers, the Morgans, they all went in and stole from the land and left the people just poor. And there's still a mess to it to this very day. And then you have people that are like liberals that go in there like, oh, we'll fix things. And they make things worse because they half-ass it or they don't work with the people in understanding what they need. I know that he's Italian. I know Parenti's Italian. But yeah, so yeah. So I don't know. If no one else wants to come up, I could be done. I could be done now. So, all right. I will Thursday, same time. I'll put out a reminder tomorrow. I'll put out a video tomorrow on it. And we'll be doing chapter 3, which it's chapter 3 basically just I don't know, it's all the 1800s. It's it's not pretty, so just be prepared for that. Thank you, Paul, for coming. Thank you all for coming and listening to me babble. But I hope this is I like doing it this way. I do want to tell you all, Esha of Historically, who I am a producer for, I have now convinced her to do Lit with Lennon again. So we had done the Sundays with Lennon. That was Late Nights with Lennon. Then we changed the name right before she went to Russia to start working on. She's working on a book. She's living there and working on a history book. She's starting with Lenin in his early days, and then she's writing about the USSR, like a history. So she's been over there on a visa, writing this book through her university. And so I have convinced her on Sundays at noontime on Historically, we're going to be kind of similar. We do it a little different. She kind of like talks after every paragraph or two. Like she will explain Lenin and what he's saying, and we get into the history of it. But she's also going to start reading her book for everyone. So if you are following, or you go over, it's Historically, like underscore ly, Historically. It's green and orange and white is the logo, because there is another Historically up there that was not so just you can follow that. I'll put some stuff out for that too if you guys want to come listen. I this is where Asha kind of started doing this with the Lenin stuff, and this was always kind of the way it really helped me learn Lenin in the last, it was like 4 years ago when we started it. So I really learned a lot about Lenin and what he was talking about. So if you enjoy this, you'll probably enjoy that show. So I hope to see you guys all there, and thank you. Have a good night.